I've been at NPR a long time, 25 years. You could say I'm a lifer. And it's a place I've always loved working. But when I started, there was a liberal orientation, but I think we were more guided by curiosity, open-mindedness. I think that's evolved over the years into a much narrower kind of niche thinking, a group think that's really clustered around very selective progressive views that don't allow enough air, enough spaciousness to consider all kinds of perspectives.
You just heard from a veteran editor over at NPR. His name is Yuri Berliner, and he penned a lengthy piece on the Free Press in regard to the changes that he has experienced firsthand over at NPR. And he is in fact critical of NPR. He feels that some of the changes in the way they cover the news has actually been negative, and he's hoping that things turn around. The piece is titled, "I've been at NPR for 25 years. Here's how we lost America's trust." And I think that he makes several excellent points in the piece. I don't agree with everything he writes in the piece, but I do want to share both the elements I agree with, the elements I disagree with, and some of the feedback and backlash he has gotten as a result for writing about this. Now, he is not a fan of Trump. He does make that abundantly clear, but he also makes clear that he started seeing changes in the way NPR reported the news around 2016 when Trump became president or was running for president and when the election was taking place. So Trump is also now, unfortunately, using this piece that was penned by Berliner to argue that NPR should be defunded. We'll get to that. I disagree with that, but I'm hoping that this will be a teachable moment for NPR and that they improve moving forward. Because again, I do think that Yuri makes some great points here. Now, let's break down what Berliner had to say about his current employer. He summarizes his basic thesis as follows. It's true NPR has always had a liberal bent, but during most of my tenure here, an open-minded, curious culture prevailed. Today, those who listen to NPR or read its coverage online find something different, the distilled worldview of a very small segment of the United States population. Now, Berliner states that the change, again, began during the election of Donald Trump. He says that Trump's election in 2016 was greeted at NPR with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and despair. But what began as tough, straightforward coverage of a belligerent, truth-impaired president veered toward efforts to damage or topple Trump's presidency. So that excerpt to me is very important to share with you all because it's clear that he's no fan of Trump, but in his heart, I can tell that he really values journalistic principles, which require you to be fair to all parties, including the politicians you do not favor. And I'm gonna admit that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And I know that I have failed in that regard. I think a lot of people fail in that regard because we're human. So I totally understand where people are coming from. I understand where he's coming from, and I think that he does make a good point there.
Pausing here to deliver some honest truth as we do in our news coverage as well. TYT is facing challenges, guys, as the entire industry is. You know who could make the difference? You. If you hit the join button below, it's gonna make all the difference and keep us in business. We appreciate you, thank you.
He says that persistent rumors that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia over the election became the catnip that drove reporting. But when the Mueller report found no credible evidence of collusion, NPR's coverage was notably sparse. In fact, in his piece, Berliner also focuses on how NPR, during this time, during the Russia investigation, would just take Congressman Adam Schiff's statements as gospel. They wouldn't question it, they wouldn't look into it, they wouldn't try to find corroborating evidence to bolster what Schiff would say. They would just print it. And Berliner felt that that was not the right way to go in doing accurate journalism and accurate coverage of the Russia investigation. And he also explains that his issue isn't with the fact that NPR was incorrect on that story, right? As we made mistakes on that story too, because we were reading outlets like NPR and relying on them for their coverage. But his issue is really with the fact that NPR never acknowledged that they had made a mistake And conversely, Berliner describes how NPR deliberately ignored the Hunter Biden laptop story, which, that story was also something that was immediately discredited, wrongly so, because there was this narrative that it was a Russian propaganda, it was orchestrated by Russia in order to throw the election in favor of Donald Trump. And I bought into that argument too. So I think Berliner makes a good point here. During a meeting with colleagues, I listened as one of NPR's best and most fair-minded journalists said it was good we weren't following the laptop story because it could help Trump. And that's the thing, guys. I think this is where some issues have come up in recent years. Because if you're a journalist, you report the news. You don't make decisions about what you do and don't report based on which politician you could be helping or hurting, right? And I see that decision gets made quite often, whereas before there was a little more fairness in covering everything rather than having reporters see that or editors see themselves as activists first and journalists second. When you're an activist, well, then you make decisions based on what your political preferences are. When you're a journalist, you focus on fairness, objectivity, not neutrality, objectivity, and you want to get to the bottom of the story, you want to get the facts. And so Berliner says that's something that kind of started to fall apart over at NPR. According to Berliner, NPR similarly dismissed the COVID lab leak story, so he gives a lot of different examples. Now, let's pivot to who he blames in the piece for this change in direction. He points a finger at the former NPR CEO, his name is John Lansing, who took the position back in 2019, obviously a year before the racial reckoning that we had in this country, the George Floyd murder that took place in 2020. So Berliner claims that NPR leadership gave the following guidance in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. America's infestation with systemic racism was declared loud and clear. It was a given. Our mission was to change it. Now, again, if you are an advocate, an activist, an ally, your mission is to change it. If you're a journalist, though, or a journalistic outlet or publication, as NPR is that really your job, or is your job to report the facts and of the current events that you're reporting on as they stand? And so that conflict was taking place within the newsroom over at NPR, and it appears that no one really had the guts to speak out against it until recently with this piece that was penned by Berliner. Lansing declared that diversity on our staff and in our audience was the overriding mission, the North Star of the organization. Phrases like, that's part of the North Star, became part of meetings and more casual conversation. And look, I think diversity is a good thing, right? You should seek diversity, not just in the workplace, but in your audience. And the way you get a more diverse audience is by, being fair to all sides. Don't cover the truth, don't provide cover for people who are doing the wrong thing. I'm not advocating for that, but by ensuring that you have different perspectives represented in your coverage. Race and identity became paramount in nearly every aspect of the workplace. Journalists were required to ask everyone we interviewed their race, gender, and ethnicity, among other questions, and had to enter it in a centralized tracking system. We were given unconscious bias training sessions. A growing DEI staff offered regular meetings imploring us to start talking about race. And what he noticed was there's this interesting dynamic playing out. On one hand, you see an increase in diversity in the workers over at NPR, but there's no diversity in thought, right? There's a very similar ideology being presented by everyone who's working at NPR, and he thought that was a problem. He wanted diversity of thought, not just diversity based on skin color. And so he states that eventually an unspoken consensus emerged in NPR, stemming mainly from the lack of viewpoint diversity. Stories on how the Beatles and bird names are racially problematic and others that are alarmingly divisive justifying looting with claims that fears about crime are racist, and suggesting that Asian Americans who oppose affirmative action have been manipulated by white conservatives. So those were the things that he took issue with over at NPR. And I don't know how NPR is going to respond to the fact that he wrote this piece, but he does conclude that while his coworkers are congenial and hardworking, he believes that NPR needs more ideological diversity. To his point, in DC, where NPR is headquartered, and many of us live, I found 87 registered Democrats working in editorial positions and 0 Republicans, none. And look, guys, I do think it's important to have people you disagree with working with you, because they're gonna provide a perspective that might force you to reconsider the way you're reporting a story. Maybe there's a fact that you're unaware of, and you might be unaware of it because we all live in filter bubbles depending on what our political ideology is. And so again, it's one thing to support the idea of diversity based on skin color, and I do think that it is important to have diversity in the workplace, but it's not just about skin color, it's also about viewpoints. It's also about lived experiences. It's also about ideology. You want diversity of ideology represented as well. The audience of NPR now reflects the makeup of the company. So back in 2011, for instance, although NPR's audience tilted a bit to the left, it still bore a resemblance to America at large. 26% of listeners described themselves as conservative, 23% as middle of the road, and 37% as liberal. But things changed, and they changed substantially. So by 2023, the picture was completely different. Only 11% described themselves as very or somewhat conservative, 21% as middle of the road, and 67% of listeners said they were very or somewhat liberal. We weren't just losing conservatives, we were also losing moderates and traditional liberals. Now, this has led to some backlash, which honestly, I don't know if I agree with. So let's start with Mehdi Hassan, who says, this essay has it backwards. You can't blame NPR for conservatives not listening. You have to ask why conservatives have gone down conspiracy holes, climate change, 2020 election, vaccines, and how on earth mainstream media is supposed to cater to them now. But I think in that statement, Mehdi Hassan makes a mistake that I myself was making for a long time, where I was just lumping in all conservatives as one thing. They're all QAnon believers. They're all this, they're all that, but there are gradations, there are factions within the Republican Party and among conservatives. Right now, there's actually a growing divide among traditional conservatives who tend to side with the neocon faction of the Republican Party. And then you have the MAGA crowd, the America First crowd that's much more isolationist. And so I think it's a mistake to kind of conflate everyone and lump them all together. The same thing can be said about the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has so many different factions at this point. I mean, you have the progressive end of the political spectrum on the Democrat side. You have the Democrats who are more in line, honestly, with neoconservatives when it comes to foreign policy. So again, like I would hate to be lumped in with that crowd of the Democratic Party, right? So I think, again, it's important to have different perspectives represented because it gives you a more nuanced worldview and it leads to more accurate reporting. Finally, Donald Trump, of course, he's used this as an opportunity to advocate for defunding NPR. He said, no more funding for NPR, total scam. Editors said they have no Republicans and is only used to damage Trump. They are a liberal disinformation machine, not $1. Well, I disagree with that. I wouldn't want to defund NPR, but I do think this could potentially be a teachable moment. Berliner says that after he penned this piece, some of his colleagues reached out to him, obviously in private. I've had this experience myself, where they thanked him for speaking out and they're hoping that things change for the better. Lansing is no longer the CEO of NPR, so things might actually change, we'll see. But I don't want it to change in a way that is unfair to the left and overly fair to the right. We just need accurate, straight news reporting. We've got a ton of people doing commentary, including myself, including everyone at TYT. But when it comes to straight news reporting, we need it to be straight. We need to know the facts and we need to know the reality of any situation that we're covering. We're never gonna know that reality if it's highly influenced by one specific political ideology.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.